Okay, welcome everyone to the iTeam webcast broadcast. This is episode 7. My name is Steve Sinkoff, your host. I'm joined by my friend, colleague, and co-host Norm Poynter from Asset Management Advocates. iTeam stands for Innovative Technologies and Methodologies Enhancing Asset Management. Over the next 40 minutes, you'll have an opportunity to send us your questions in the Q&A tab below if you haven't already. Please do send us your questions. We'll try to get to all of them. I'll send you a short survey just after the webcast ends. Please do take 5 minutes to give us your thoughts. Last week we spoke about bills and materials, and Norm said it was his favorite topic. But today we're talking about standardization and governance of asset information. I know that this is on par or maybe an inch behind because he talks and stresses about it all the time. I think that there are many hurdles that organizations need to get over to leverage the opportunity of good data standards and governance. And we hope to get to many of those hurdles in this discussion today. I'm really glad today that we have with us George Broadbent, the VP of Asset Management from Microdesk. I met George a couple of years ago at our Smart Infrastructure Forum in New York City, and I was impressed with the work they're doing. So I'm thrilled to have him here with Norm to unravel this complicated and highly charged topic. A lot of what we discuss in the iTeam webcasts has to do with, is focused on innovation, but without the proper foundation, you can't strut your stuff. So this is a methodology discussion today with two experts in the field of asset data. If you want real innovation, it starts here. You gotta build innovation off of a good foundation. So this is the meat on the bones. So Norm, let me bring you into the discussion. I was thinking about this interview and the questions that we were going to ask, and I was faced with the challenge of the chicken and the egg. So what comes first, standards or governance? And then I came to the conclusion that you can't govern what isn't somewhat standardized. True or false?
Whoa, Steve, thanks so much again for hosting one of these events. And I don't know, maybe we should do a bill of material standardization webinar, and then I could combine two of these favorite topics of mine. I think one of the words you threw into your sentence there was somewhat standardized, so I'll play on that for a second. Electricity around the world is somewhat standardized, right? Plugs in North America all similarly work the same, they look the same, but go to Europe or go to Australia or go to Asia and there's variances. So subsequently, manufacturers have to make the travel pack of electrical adapters, right? And then we can get into the voltages and the amps and the hertz and all that stuff that is somewhat standardized. We live in a world like that we have to deal with units of measure in Canada, even though we're the metric system. I grew up in purgatory, being part imperial when I was younger, and then as I aged, moving over to metric, but still there's variances in that model. Go to any gym. I'm sitting in Calgary where it's snowing right now. Go to any gym here in Calgary, you're not going to find weights in kilograms, you're going to find them in pounds. So this concept of standardization, I think it's very difficult to govern without standardization. So I think the standard has to come before the governance. And I always say that exception to the rule create confusion. And so subsequently, that exception to a rule, to a standard is going to introduce confusion in the organization. And I'm pretty sure we'll talk about that today because it really, we're targeting data, we're targeting reporting, we're targeting trying to gain benefits from that data. If there's exceptions to the rule, people are going to be confused.
Cool. Well, let me bring George into the conversation. George, can you give us just a brief elevator pitch on yourself?
Sure. So first, Steve and Norm, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really appreciate it. I love these webcasts and the discussions that you've had with them in the past. So, but a little bit about me, like you said, I'm currently the VP of Asset Management for Microdesk, an AECO consulting firm, architects, engineers, construction, all the way through operations. We kind of look at the full building life cycle. But my background started off in mechanical engineering. And then I moved into systems management, systems architecture. This is kind of in the early days of corporate PCs and networks. And so I quickly had an affinity for how do all these systems connect to each other? And then that evolved rather rapidly into data management. And I started to look at both structured data, databases you can think of, and unstructured data, documents. And how does an organization deal with this mass of information, which, back then we measured it in, in megabytes and gigabytes. And now we're into, measuring in petabytes. But, it was this path that really led me into asset management. So I take a very data-centric view to asset management, and how does the information get created? How does it get read? How does it get used? And when you're looking at a pump, it's a data source to me, at least. And so data optimization is really what's driven my career. So this is a subject today that's near and dear to my heart.
Excellent, excellent. So as I mentioned in my welcome, my belief is that standardization of asset data could be the most important foundational element that any organization can take advantage of. But as we know, and through our research, we have found out that many of them don't. So George, can you describe your view of data standards and why organizations must or should take advantage of the powerful opportunity that they create?
Yeah, and there's some great terms that you use there. The must and the should. Because it to me it's both. They should be doing the governance piece. They should be standardizing their data. And in certain cases, they must do it. You kind of look at the different industries that people are in. Especially when you have regulated reporting requirements, internal and external reporting requirements. Then it's a must. And then you kind of move into the grayer areas there where you're affecting production, and you should do it, but then you're in manufacturing. You're not necessarily reporting on a regulated basis, but it's going to affect your bottom line. So therefore, you must do it. So it's a must and a should. Is the bottom line. So data standards means to me that you are establishing a dictionary, a language that you're going to use throughout your organization. And you're going to establish the methods and the means by which you are going to collect information over the long haul. And the time frame that we refer to here is over years and decades. And because asset management is not a short-term solution. Asset management is something that we're communicating to the future of our current state, so that we can analyze the current, the information that we're generating. And that's kind of the best way that I can look at data standards. How am I going to talk to that person 20 and 30 years from now about what the current state is, so that we can continue to evolve and make the facility better.
Wow. So I love it when there's folks on the webinar that are supportive of the facilitators and mentioned that my closet doors were open. And I pop up and go close them. That's fantastic. I love that.
So I will edit it out afterwards.
Yeah. Fantastic. Anyway, thank you to the powers that be that I have friends out there that are looking out for me. That's great. Okay, language. Let's talk about language for a second, because the word should, the word must, the word will, the word shall, we are, even from standardization, we're using those differently. And I think that creates some confusion inside of organizations, from a policy to a standard to a procedure. Even when we look at ISO standards, we look at the normative references versus the informative references, and ISO would throw in a shall versus a must. And so I think even there's some work to be done there. But George, what I really liked about what you said there was, when you think about data standards, you're thinking 20, 30 years into the future. How am I communicating with someone in the future? And how can I retain that consistency? I think that is so very important. And I'm sure I'll talk about it a couple times, and maybe now is not the best, but cartography and map making is another analogy that's very near and dear to my heart. So when you talk about data standards, I feel we're trying to construct a key. We're trying to build out this long key of indexing and addresses that are very unique to ensure that record or that item we're discussing retains that information. And I always use the analogy, if I tell you to go to 7th Ave and 7th Street in Calgary, you're going to end up in 4 places because it's a quadrant city, and I forgot to tell you Southwest. So what have you seen for standards that have worked? Maybe you have some examples from your perspective. And I think we also maybe need to talk projects and, greenfield, brownfield, sustainment, that sort of thing. So I think they're different to some degree. Boy, that was a lot. Sorry about that.
No. There's a lot of topics in there, but I love the analogy of the key. It's being able to unlock the history of that piece of equipment, and how does that piece of equipment affect the other systems within the organization. It could be a manufacturing line. It could be just regulated assets. Your emergency generator. But in terms of standards that we've worked with in the past and that we've seen, the three big ones that come to mind are the COBE standard, which is the Construction Operations Building Information Exchange. A lot easier to say COBE. But basically, it's how do you take data from construction, move it into operations? How do you exchange information? It's a very comprehensive standard. Other ones are like Uniformat, OmniClass. Those are the other very comprehensive standards. But what happens is, we'll take COBE for an example. There are 30 or 40 spreadsheets that make up the COBE standard. Like I said, comprehensive. And people, want to chop it up. Like, they don't like the way that, the floor drain is called in this thing, or they say, we don't even want to track those things. Or say, okay, we'll chop that out. And you start to tailor it to the organization's language. And we start to look at how this language really develops within the organization, really. And that's what I think a lot of times, we haven't really run into many organizations that say, okay, we're just going to adopt COBE and that's it. With the exception of like the federal government. I think they're kind of like, 100% into COBE. But a lot of organizations tailor it. They take it apart and they look to have the standard adapted to their language. And I always use the example of, the organization calls this, the old building or the old foundry, and the finance folks call it, building 31. And how do we all call it the same thing? And that's so the standards allow us to develop that common language over the 10, 20, 30 years of the organization.
And I think that, Steve, I'm just going to jump in here for a sec if you don't mind, but I think that's very important because over the course of time, in the early years of my career, I was very much about we had to do things a certain way and we couldn't vary from that. And that didn't work, right? I went to a site not that long ago that everybody there called that pump the blue pump in the southwest corner of the, right? And even the drawing they had, which was handwritten, like it wasn't even a P&ID generated out of a CAD system. It had a little picture of a pump that somebody had drawn and it said the blue pump or whatever. And then there was a red pump and there was a yellow pump. That's how they knew that stuff. And it'd been like that for 30 years.
There's a great example here outside of Philadelphia of the highway system. I'll give you this little thing here. So when they were planning 476, which is a kind of a major north-south corridor, they had multiple options: a blue route, a red route, and a black route or something like that. And they finally settled on the blue route as the corridor that would be built. So me, as being a transplant to the Philadelphia area, I would call it 476 because that's what it shows on the map. And everybody would look at me like, oh, where is that? And then finally somebody realized, they go, oh, you mean the blue route? And I'm like, where does it say blue route?
That's funny.
That is funny. I've always wondered about that because you also see, if you're further north, you see 476. So
Exactly,
I
right.
about that.
Yes.
Well, I'm waiting for that old 31 bourbon to come out. Actually,
yes,
standard.
yes, me too.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, let's switch the subject a bit. Let's take it a little bit further. We've talked about standards a bit. So it seems that both of you are experts, strongly believe that asset standards are critical, right? So we agree to that. And we know that many organizations are looking to improve or optimize the results of their current data initiatives. But in our research, many don't apply data governance strategy. So why do we need governance? And how can you streamline that in your implementation, no matter where you are in that equation?
Yeah, governance is a great topic. I'm a big advocate for governance, but not so much governance that's overly burdensome, or to use the bureaucratic term, because governance organizations can evolve into their own little fiefdom, if you will, but an anecdote that I have is from a customer who, understood that they needed to standardize their data. And so they embarked upon the standardization process. And then they would look at how they can maintain those standards. So they develop a set of, data dictionaries and guidelines for their standards. And then they realized that, okay, we need to have a governance group in place. And so when you look at that interaction, you start to realize how people need to have the governance in place to control the standards that have been established. And so the governance group is primarily responsible for how do we check the box that they've adhered to the standard, and then just handle the exceptions. And that's really kind of critical to an effective or an efficient operating governance group. And so when there's an exception, because you're not going to plan for everything in the first go around, there's always going to be exceptions. 5 years from now, new equipment goes into place, replacement of equipment, how does that change? And so the governance group wants to look at those changes, bring it back to the standard, adapt the standard, but adapt it in a way that the language doesn't change or negate what's already been captured.
So is there a definite measure of benefit by having this stuff right? Is there a way to quantify that?
So the quantification, the measure of it comes into, really comes a little bit later on when you're looking back on the data that you've collected. So another customer of ours, they started their data journey 5 years ago. They're building a new campus. They started to look at how can we standardize our information that's being collected. They started collecting it in a unified way. Granted, they were using spreadsheets initially. They've been adapting that process, and but now they're in the position where they can look back over 5 years of data and see where it is that they've been spending money. How well are things performing? What is the predictions that they can make now on their equipment? How can they improve their energy usage? How can they control labor costs? Because they have this rich, unified or standardized set of data that they can tap into. And that's really where the benefit comes from them.
Big philosophical discussion around benefit and governance. And I just wanted to add one thing before I forget is I'm a fan of reviewing those standards like Kobe, just for the spirit of them. There might be something in there you can take away and apply. Like you mentioned, it's a building sort of standard, but the folks here from other industries that aren't necessarily dealing with buildings could probably apply the same spirit of that standard. Just want to mention that the effort that I think that goes into some of these projects, and I see we've got some questions that have come in, so I'll be excited to answer some of those when we get to the end. But the effort that goes into some of this stuff is a big task, right? And it's often never finished either. Even though you have a project start and a project end, it never actually gets done, right? The entropy creeps in to that data long before you finish the project. So what's the best case scenario here, George? Like, how do you recommend implementing or putting governance in place that's highly functional but not bureaucratic and not a burden to the organization? Because again, it's the scales of justice with respect to, you can't micromanage this either. So what are your thoughts on that?
So if I could touch on one thing that you just said there, and we have to look at data like we do the equipment in our facilities. If we were to not maintain this pump over the course of 5 years, the condition of the pump will deteriorate. The energy usage will go up, meaning the effort it takes to operate that pump goes up, and then ultimately it will fail, due to lack of maintenance. Data is the same way. Data is only valid so long as it's being maintained, and that's where the standards and the governance comes into play. So how do we make governance so that it's not bureaucratic? And I kind of touched on it before with we want to be able to have the governance group handling the exceptions. Check the box, say, yes, you've complied with the standards, you're good to go. Don't make a lot of checkpoints in there. So, another customer in a healthcare field, they put in place, 8 plus checkpoints in their governance group, and they're checking every single thing there, and it literally adds weeks, if not months, to schedules to implement. So streamline it so that if you've complied with the standard, you're not asking for a variance. Check the box, let them go on, move them on, and then handle the exceptions for the new things that come up, and empower them so that they can also reject things that are just, like come out of the blue. Like for example, like, when you're creating attributes for piece of equipment, you take a pump, for example. If you're already measuring the horsepower of the pump, why would you, somebody might want to say, yeah, but I want to report on, the horsepower in this field here so that I can manipulate it and play with different values. It's like, no, you can't do that. Like, just use the horsepower. We're not going to add it to the standard, but in your own calculations, you can go ahead and create a new variable that you want. We're not going to modify the standards just because of this one off use case. A little long-winded there, sorry.
Okay, so now we've covered standards and governance. I want to go back to the cost benefit. We mentioned it a little bit earlier, and this is going to be sort of a complicated question with a lot of different attributes to it. But a lot of organizations, or the organizations on this call, from what I can see, we're covering a lot of different industries. They have tens of thousands of assets. And in order to go through like a data cleansing program or to try to fix all the data, that cost would be just astronomical, and what a huge effort. So, if you do this kind of effort, am I able to rationalize that benefit and be able to get the payback? And am I able to run more reliably, for instance, or are there other things? Can I, there are lots of companies have lots of data, but do they know how to use it? Do they have access to it? There are just so many different issues that come up. Then can I do this on just my critical assets, or do I have to do it on all my assets? So how do I cost justify that in a bigger scale?
Yeah, and then this is a great topic, and this is really where it's sort of, the rubber meets the road here, in that sense, and that the purpose of standardization and governance is ultimately to control costs. Some of my clients have called it cost avoidance. Some of them have called it cost savings, because because what you're doing is that you're not necessarily measuring this so that you can cut headcount, but you're going to be able to redirect the effort of people to be more effective. So classic example that we run into all the time is data entry. So a lot of times organizations will take a facility supervisor and effectively put in the equivalent of one full-time person just to do data entry. Now, if I'm able to streamline the data entry process in the beginning, then I don't need to, I'm not cutting that full-time person, but I'm redirecting them to more efficient, more effective work. And so that's the cost avoidance piece there. It's, how do I make sure that people are doing a job that's purposeful and meaningful. So when I look at cost benefit, again, going back to the asset management over time analogy there, we can't say, okay, I've collected data for a month, and now next month I can look at it and see where I can save money. No, because there's too many variables involved in it. There's there's seasonality, there's overtime, there's the variability of the equipment. So we need to collect data for. I tell customers, you collect data for 4 seasons. That's it. Like, do that, and we have a baseline now from which we can then respond and look at where you're spending your money, how to mitigate costs, how to control costs from there. And then, I'll touch on briefly on the asset criticality piece. And you want to be able to apply your data standards to all of your assets. And you might have a flag in there that says it's a critical asset, it's a regulated asset, it's and it's none of the above. But when you and another analogy is here. We had a healthcare customer that was looking at they got a 20% cut in their operating budget. So they had to look at their critical assets, their regulated assets, and everything else. Critical and regulated, there's no change to it. Maintenance programs are the exact same. And everything else that was, kind of fell below the line, that's where the cuts would begin. And so they would defer maintenance on those items there. But now you have to start to look at then, what are my replacement costs for that equipment? And how can I justify cutting maintenance and a replacement cost that we're going to now accelerate? So instead of, if the equipment lasts for 10 years and now I might have to replace it after 5 because I've deferred maintenance, how do I justify that? Is it, you don't want to kick the can down the road in terms of your costs because future money is more expensive. Anyway, so this is where the data comes into play, and how can we standardize it so we can really get a good picture of everything.
Okay, so we have about 2 minutes left before we go to our overtime. We've got a number of questions coming in, but let me just get to one component. This is actually for both George and Norm. So with this group on the webcast, the mountain is incredibly high, right? So, or with any group, they have lots of assets. They're all asset-intensive groups. How do they get over the hump? There's so much data and so many assets, and this is an undertaking is just so huge. And the answer, the business case, you've answered the business case sort of in the last couple of questions, but what about the people side of it? How do I get around that old grumpy, actually let's make it that young grumpy electrical tech, because I didn't want to disparage myself, who insists that this is the way it is and this is the way we always did it, and there's a culture thing that has to happen. So how do you get over that hump?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up the people aspect of it, because it's really important. I've seen so many systems fail because they don't involve the folks that are actually working with the equipment, using the data. So go back to the example of, old 31 building, versus 31A. Just use the name. It's just, it's one more data field. So when I search for, old building, or old foundry rather, old foundry, that I can still find it. So I can still use the language that I'm comfortable with, but at the same time, that building 31 is in there, and the finance folks are satisfied. It's not going to change, it's not going to exponentially increase the amount of data that you have to collect or do anything like that, but it's going to keep everybody involved, and it's also going to make them feel empowered that they're a part of the system. So the people aspect and change management associated with it is so incredibly important in this whole process. You avoid it or don't do this. Don't do the change management process at your own peril.
Okay, so we're out of time for our first 30 minutes. Let's go into a little bit of overtime. We'll ask some questions, get some questions from the audience. Norm, why don't you take the first one?
Okay, well, I'm going to go to the chat first. I'm just going to address a couple of things that came up in chat. So there was a question, what about technical strategies, standardized and standard maintenance activities, standard packages for repair and maintenance works? And I think that's a somewhat of a whole deeper subject, but I'd also actually point that back to the webinar we had with Chris and Curtis on progressive plan, and a little bit with Ted Lister when we talked to him, because really those guys are out in the world talking about standardizing maintenance practices and standardizing planning and job planning, et cetera, based on activities they've performed around the world, indicating that we can do a tube and bundle exchanger pull the same way anywhere in the world. We just have to adjust to weather and culture and things like that. So I think the technical nature of maintenance we've kind of covered in a couple other webinars. So for the fellow that asked that, if you want to reach out directly, happy to talk about that or point you to some of those webinars. The other one was, don't most reporting tools have conversion engines? And sure, all of these software products have some type of conversion in them. However, the introduction of conversion is an exception to the rule, which creates confusion. I'll go back to that. And someone has to manage that. So absolutely, if that's the strategy, then let's make use of that technology to do so, I would say. But I think that's part of your strategy when it comes to standardization and governance. So now I'll get to the first question. Sorry about that.
Actually, go to the second one, because he just sent us a text saying he's going to leave. Maybe we can get this question in.
In a long-term horizon, how organizations should manage data information lifecycle, data obsolescence, how we assure assumptions and frameworks are still valid after 20 plus years.
And that's a great question, because it is a long-term COVID life. So when we look out at 20 years from now, we can't obviously know everything that's going to be used and needed for the next 20 years, and that's really critical. But the governance group really has to be able to look at this and say, how is this new piece of information changing what we do, and changing our assumptions that we made about data, and then put in place the change control process that's necessary for updating the data from the past and going forward with a new set of data. And a lot of organizations get stuck on this, where they try to make the data standards perfect and say, okay, now we have something here. And perfect is hard to do.
Yeah, very, very hard to do. Sorry, I'd like to just add into that too. I think if we integrate, I think integration is really key to this. So if we understand the operating context of that asset, and that if that operating context says that this asset is going to operate in this fashion for 20 or 30 years, then we have to integrate how we manage that information in the same way. And I don't see many organizations that bring integrated activity planning and scheduling into the data discussion, right?
Mm.
So many organizations will say, we're going to do these things over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but it's really operating context only. It doesn't include the data operating context. And so subsequently, the data people are off trying to develop standards. They have no real vision to what's happening over the long term. So I think you got to integrate those two activities.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we have another question. Asset data management has been a mammoth task every organization faces.
Mhm.
What practice/approach should be followed to cleanse, enrich the existing asset data? So not going forward, what do we do with the data that we've already have?
So I am sort of on the fence about organizations that embark on dedicated data collection efforts. In some contexts, it makes sense. In some contexts, it's overly expensive. So there's little upside or little benefit to it. Like I know in the New York region, some of the estimates were that data collection costs about $65 per asset. Yeah, and so it may not be wise to embark upon that unless you've got really deep pockets. So the answer is like to build it into your maintenance routines. So when you have like a tear down of a piece of equipment, include in there a task for updating the data fields. Now, granted, your information won't be perfect from day one. Again, perfect is hard, and so you can start, but at least it's a start. And again, taking that 5-year view of things, you will over time get more and more accurate data. I'm a big fan of that approach. But data is, I think they put it like data does deteriorate over time. So you do need these kind of regular, refreshes and updates on the equipment.
Yeah, and there's so many examples of this. So I agree completely, George. We'll go back to Nick Ruddick's, the webinar with Nick, when we talked about entropy, because about a year or so ago, he and I are having a bill of material and a parts book conversation, and he goes, well, it's suffering from entropy. I'm like, what in the wide world of sports is entropy? I do not know anything about the thermodynamics laws. Anyway, it's the second law of thermodynamics. It says everything degrades, basically. The point to that, and it was brilliant, and if you want to go back to the webinar, he says it on the webinar because I made sure he did because I wanted to get it out there, is that we should be dealing with this at the work phase. We should be dealing with it as it happens. So too many times have I seen plant data walkdowns occur where everybody goes out and collects nameplate data. They come back, they report on what they have in the system. They don't report on the exceptions. So there's a manufacturer that's left blank, or there's a serial number that's left blank. Well, the next maintenance manager comes along and goes, why do we have all these blank fields? Off they go collecting data again. They don't really improve the data because it was blank the first time. But if we'd have just said, not available, torn off, if we'd have put some marker in that field to report on the exception, we wouldn't be going back out there again to do that.
True.
So the fact is that as we're maintaining equipment, as we're performing our daily tasks, I too believe we have to manage the entropy. And Stephen Crampton from Orbital used to say that as well. He would talk about the degradation or the corrosion of data, just like corrosion in a pipe occurs over time, and how you have to stay on top of it. So the big projects to get it done they don't work.
Correct. Yeah, and it's all a matter of like, how do you manage that process? How do you incorporate it into your maintenance routines? Do specialized data collections? I mean, it's a part of the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next question. This is a good one too. At what level in the organization should governance be?
Yeah, and that is a good question. It I think of my old saying about standards. I love standards, and the fact that there are so many to choose from makes it easy. Governance within an organization is like that. Like there are many different models for it, but it should involve all levels. Is the key thing. So you want somebody from the risk organization in there, for example. You want facility manager. Maybe you want a representative from the technical staff or the trades there. Some of these things are way outside of people's comfort zones, but just so they can hear the discussion and the understanding of why it is, so they can communicate out to the rest of the organization how important it is the key thing. So having that cross-section across the organization is the key thing. If you've got two people, from the same department that are in there, the lateral effect that governance has on the organization is going to be muted. So it's not so much the level, it's the breadth across the organization.
Yeah, we're just about out of time. I'm going to ask you one more question that's come in. Is change management integration part of the design and strategy phase?
Yes. Yeah, short answer is yeah. So when you're designing a new line, you want to understand, and we run, from our perspective, we run into, we deal with architects, engineers, contractors, all the way through the entire life cycle. So if you're putting together a new line for manufacturing, and here's another example. So building management system goes into place. The BMS guys are given 11 by 17 plans of what the equipment looks like. The designer calls it, VAV 1 through 10. And so they put in their building management system, it's VAV 1 through 10. And then later on, people go, where is that? What is that? We don't have a VAV 1. And so, in the design and the strategy, the planning, when you're doing your renovation and your projects or your projects, that you are incorporating all of these, the data standards into it.
Awesome. Well, guys, we've run out of time, and I think we could probably have this conversation for another hour or so very easily. I want to thank everybody. George, thank you so much for having this great conversation with us. Norm, again, thanks. Good job. And everybody that attended, thank you for attending. The video will be up probably end of the day tomorrow. Just a reminder, next week, the 29th, which is Thursday at 11:30. We have another great webcast. This is on a smarter asset management software, and it's with Tacoma Zach and John Clow. They're from a company called Mentor APM. Really interesting discussion. We've had some talks with them, and I think that you're gonna get a lot out of that conversation. So please do consider attending. But again, thank you, everybody. Appreciate the attendance. Guys, great job.
Thanks so much, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful.